There. My mom wouldn't let me have guns. She wouldn't let me have anything that even looked like a gun. Cap guns, no ray guns, no squirt guns, no BB guns, definitely no real guns. In the late 70s, I wasn't really interested in the latter. Nah, the only things that I wanted, that I coveted back then, was this. And I couldn't have it. I would barter with friends for a few other pieces. Like this little cap gun, shoots the paper rolls with the snap, with little paper caps. Had this since at least 1984. I'm now a 46-year-old man. And I got my Han Solo blaster. And a few other pieces. You should see how many I had to leave at home. So based, in part, on this purely anecdotal evidence, I have come to the conclusion that banning guns is problematic. But more on that in a bit. Howdy, I'm Sean McCardle. I've been a prop master, prop fabricator, special effect designer, and theatrical firearms safety trainer for the last 25 years, which is also the same number of years it's been since I've been on stage. Thanks to my experience in teaching firearms safety, I've been very conscious of a huge shift in our country's cultural attitudes towards guns. We have more than 300 million guns in this country. We also have a massive gun violence problem that we're not doing anywhere enough to fight. I have lots of thoughts on this, but over the years, one basic idea has held my focus. Wouldn't it be great if anybody who wanted to own a firearm was required to have at least as much safety training as we give to actors before we'll let them fire blank guns on stage? I talk to folks about this a lot. Folks from a variety of different political viewpoints. I talk to folks at work, at the diner, at my high school reunion, at the bar, with folks on the internet. This stuff played remarkably well with those folks at the reunion, which featured a variety of small town residents, military vets, truckers, farmers, and it's part of what inspired me to do this. I will talk to anybody who will listen, and I have a hard time finding anyone who will disagree with me on this simple point, that if you want to own a gun, you need to know how to use it safely. So even though I've never done such a thing before, here I am doing a fringe show about it. No one is more surprised about this than me. I grew up in a small college town and farming community in rural Nebraska, outside Lincoln, called Crete. It sounds cliche, but guns were a part of life. This Elmer Fudd doll was handmade by my mother and was my first and most treasured toy. I remember watching my grandfather clean his long guns and load his own shotgun shells. These guns were his and my uncle's. I was taken duck hunting when I was 5, along with a couple of those guns. I learned to target shoot with the .22 rifle at Boy Scout camp. My dad had a shotgun in the back of a closet that he got as a graduation present. My other grandfather kept a .22 pistol at the cabin up north in case any porcupines came around threatening the dogs. One Thanksgiving at the family farm, I joined my uncles who were shooting trap out in one of the cornfields. I don't think I'd ever shot trap before, but my accuracy was about 75%. And when they quizzed me as to why I was any good at shooting, I had to confess that the only reason was video games. Speaking of the folks at that reunion, a bunch of them were on the Crete High School co-ed rifle and trap shooting teams. This is a shot from my 1989 high school yearbook, from the sports section. They really did keep their long guns in their lockers sometimes. They were also very responsible about how they were handled as a matter of course. Most grew up hunting, and they understood and respected guns for the tools that they are. I remember one knucklehead clowning around with a rifle before school once, and the other members of the team shut him down for it hard. They took safety very seriously. They immediately called him out, and the coach let him have it. But guns were never my thing. Not real ones. That was one effect of Mom's prohibition, and I'm grateful to her for that. My favorite heroes, besides Han Solo, reflect that. I discovered Doctor Who in the early 80s, and Tom Baker's casual disdain for guns wore off on me. Batman couldn't be any more anti-gun, along with Superman, Wonder Woman, Wolverine, Spider-Man, and Kevin Matchstick. All of them found other solutions to their problems and left the guns to Frank Castle and Deadpool. I made this gun belt, in grad school at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, where I got my MFA in theatrical prop design and management. It was a costume crafts project, and my favorite part are the seatbelt buckles. It is not a stretch to say that my career path in props has its roots in my childhood infatuation with toy weapons. I started out in theater as a lighting and set designer, but I was quickly corrupted into a life of props by my soon-to-be mentor, Jim Guy, who taught the props MFA program at the time and is currently the prop master at Milwaukee Repertory Theater. This is him. One of the classes Jim taught was Firearms for Stage, a semester-long course on theatrical firearms history and safety. That year, we did the Kentucky Cycle by Robert Schenken, which is a series of 9 one-acts performed over 6 hours, featuring firearms from every era of American history. It was a lot of guns to trap and maintain, and a lot of cast and crew to safety train. And it was also super fun, and I was hooked. To this day, Jim teaches a seminar on stage firearms safety that I've assisted him on more times than I can count. And this is a basic rundown of what we teach. The first thing we do is impress upon folks that blanks aren't safe, they are just safer. People can get hurt or killed if a weapon is used improperly. This isn't hyperbole, it's happened many times, and two tragic examples of this were John Eric Hexum and Brandon Lee. John Eric was on a show called Cover Up, in which he played a super spy working undercover as a fashion model. One day, on the set, the weapons master handed him a revolver loaded with blanks just prior to a break. And in his infinite wisdom, he decided to play Russian roulette. Lacking any understanding of the danger, he removed all the blanks except one, closed and spun the cylinder, put the barrel to his temple, pulled the trigger, and blew his own head off. A full load blank has the exact same explosive force as real ammunition. The only difference is that it lacks a bullet, a projectile. At point blank range, that force can be deadly. Too close to the side of someone's head and it can blow out an eardrum or create a fatal wound. On that note, I had originally hoped to actually shoot a blank firing weapon at this point in the show. I was going to hand out earplugs at the door and everything, but the man is keeping me down. Upon reflection, it was totally the right call, for reasons stated later. So instead, here is a video of me demonstrating this piece right here. I made it for the Pirates of Penzance. It's a joke for the Pirate King so that he can shoot off multiple shots with a single shot pistol. This particular pistol has a top vent exhaust. So as you'll be able to see in this video, the area directly above the barrel, rather than in front of it, is the danger zone. There's a blank firing pistol built inside the flintlock. And though the flintlock only fires once, this one fires 5 times. So to establish the danger zones of blank firing weapon, we evaluate each piece using a paper test. By shooting the gun next to a sheet of paper, we can determine where the force from the blast is going, so we can eliminate the danger of it harming an actor. In this video, I did 3 tests with a replica 8mm semi-automatic pistol with a blocked barrel. First I shot straight on, then I turned it 90 degrees, and then I turned it 45 degrees. Directly in front of the gun is the safe zone. Above the gun, you can start to feel the blast, but when the gun is turned at 45 degrees, we see graphically where the force of that blast is going. We repeat this test several times at different distances from the paper to identify the danger zones. With the exhaust and the expelled cartridge going out to the right, we know to make sure there are no actors blocked to stand in that area. This test is especially important if you're using an open-barreled weapon, with the exhaust going straight out the front of the barrel. I witnessed the need for this test graphically once during a tech rehearsal for a show I was doing out in LA called Bengal Tiger at the Baghdad Zoo by Rajiv Joseph, on which I was the blood effect designer. We were remounting the show in a different space a year after the original production, and when we got to the final gunfight, the actors were rusty on their blocking. The show featured a gold-plated .50 caliber Desert Eagle semi-automatic pistol, specifically one owned by Saddam Hussein. It's a hand cannon, one of the largest handguns available, and even adapted for blanks, it kicks like crazy and expels a ton of force out the front of the weapon. What should have been a safe distance of about 15 feet had been reduced to about 6. And when the shot came, the target crumpled to the floor in pain. He was fine, but the shockwave hit him so hard he felt like he'd been slugged in the gut. We reblocked the scene on the spot to reestablish safe distances and to make sure that the shooter was cheating his aim to the upstage side of the target. Here's the scene in question, though this video is actually from a tech rehearsal at the Looking Glass Theater production in Chicago.
Don't you point that at me.
Or what? What will you do now? What else can you do to me now?
I said we can leave when I get my...
Your toilet seat! You need your toilet seat!
Finger off the trigger. Take your finger off the trigger. Keep going.
So you see how the shooter is cheating his aim to the left of the target? Tech rehearsals like this are the most crucial because it's the first time an actor is integrating the firing of the weapon with the action and dialogue of the scene. He had a lot to keep in his head in that moment, in addition to making sure that he didn't hurt his fellow actor. The chaos of the scene can also help with the misdirection, so in an intense moment like this, the shock helps sell it. You can also hear the fight director, the sound's pretty bad, but you can hear the fight director reminding the actor to remove his finger from the trigger guard, which in this case is doubly important because there's another live round ready to fire in the chamber. In prep for rehearsals like these, you should always check in with local law enforcement to let them know that you're using blanks in your production. Everyone in your building needs to know about it too. In grad school, our building maintenance director was a Vietnam vet with PTSD, and we took extra care to ensure that he knew we'd be shooting so he wouldn't be surprised. It's important to test fire in the actual theater so that you can establish what the safe decibel levels are, both for the actors and for the audience. We test full, half, and quarter load blanks to see what sounds best in the space, while considering that it'll sound different when the audience is full of bodies. We stress that weapons need to be returned directly to the designated firearms master when not in use, no matter what. There is serious danger involved in simply walking out of the theater with it, thinking that it's just a prop. A passing police officer can't tell the difference and will react like it's real. Another precaution I took today is to make sure not to bring any blank ammunition with me capable of being loaded into this weapon. All teasing aside about our fringe friends being a man, I was super glad to see the email from Liz reiterating all of the safety info. If she had told me that I can actually shoot blanks at a fringe show, my jaw would have hit the floor. I knew it wasn't going to happen, but I had to ask. Any theater considering using any kind of gun as a prop must take every precaution necessary for safety, especially fringe. Another part of the training is cleaning and maintenance, which is virtually identical to cleaning actual firearms. Actors and crew need to know how to handle a misfire. If the gun jams, they learn how to clear the jam safely. We teach the crew how to clean the weapons properly, so there's no buildup of unspent powder inside the barrel, which can result in an oversized flash should it ignite. We implement security protocols so that we know the weapons are secure at all times, at all stages of the production, from weapons lockup to firearms master to actor to stage and then back again. Weapons and ammunition are kept locked up separately. The firearms master is in charge of making sure all aspects of the weapon are safe. And to illustrate this point, we use the story of Brandon Lee. On the set of the movie adaptation of the graphic novel The Crow, in which Brandon was starring, there's a sequence in which he gets shot and killed, before he comes back later from the dead as the title character. In prep for the shot, the crew made dummy bullets to use for a close-up shot of loading the gun. They removed the bullets from real ammunition. They emptied out the gunpowder, removed all the primer caps, replaced the bullets into the empty cartridges, and shot close-ups of loading the gun with them. And then at the end of the day of filming, the weapons handlers did not notice that one of the bullets had come loose from its cartridge and was wedged inside one of the cylinders. On the day they filmed the actual shooting, the same gun was used, and the full load blank that was loaded into the same cylinder in which that loose bullet was lodged ended up having the same effect as a live round. Brandon was hit in the side of the abdomen and he died on the operating table 5 hours later. These things aren't toys, they are tools. Dangerous tools if used incorrectly. Well, this is a toy. We teach the same basic gun handling procedures that hunters learn. Never aim at another person. Keep the muzzle pointed in a safe direction. Always treat any gun like it's loaded, even if you know it's not. Never aim at anything you're not prepared to shoot. Be aware of your target and what's beyond and around it. And never, ever put your finger inside the trigger guard unless you're ready to fire. All of this just scratches the surface of what's covered in a full firearms safety seminar. It was communicated to me once via a stage manager that my gun safety spiel had angered an actor. It was during a Shakespeare in the Park production of Romeo and Juliet. We were having the prince shoot off a shotgun and break up the fight between the Montagues and the Capulets at the beginning of the show. We were using a real shotgun, firing full load blanks, so the Parks Department had been notified, as well as the local NYPD precinct. In my spiel, I was extra mindful of stressing the inherent dangers of the weapon we had chosen to use since we were sitting in the middle of Central Park. The actor in question felt I was fear-mongering and shattering the confidence of the cast. To which I responded, a little fear is healthy. These are tools that need to be respected, and understanding the inherent danger is integral to that respect. Cowboy shenanigans get people hurt or killed. If the actors aren't feeling a little bit of fear regarding the consequences of misusing these weapons, then I'm not doing my job. Which brings us closer to my thoughts on gun culture in the US today and my compulsion to do this show. But first, a brief history of gun legislation and the Second Amendment in the United States. There it is, in all its grammatically ambiguous glory. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. That is a lot of commas. It's like William Shatner wrote it. How is the first part related to the second? The ambiguity has generated debate for centuries, and there are two interpretations of the Second Amendment at the heart of conflict over guns in America. On the one side, you have the militia interpretation. This argument focuses on the opening clause, the well-regulated militia part. This interpretation states that the amendment is intended to ensure that men of military age are prepared to take part in the local militia should the need arise. That it refers specifically to the rights of people actively involved in the militia, not necessarily the general public. The other argument is that the Second Amendment enshrines the right to bear arms for self-defense for all citizens, that the right to keep a weapon is a basic civil right necessary for protecting oneself, their family, and their property. What did James Madison truly have in mind when he wrote the Second Amendment? That's the real question. Before I started working on this show, I would have said I favored the militia theory mostly. After a lot of research and hundreds of conversations, I fully agree with the self-defense theory. I did not call that one either. It turns out Madison based the Second Amendment on the English Bill of Rights from 1689. King James II, a Catholic, had abused his royal authority and engaged in demagoguery. He ignored Parliament and the will of the people and created his own military force that disarmed Protestants, resulting in a bloody civil war called the Glorious Revolution. James was defeated, and part of the bargaining agreement between the new Protestant rulers, William and Mary, and the people was this English Bill of Rights. One of the rights enumerated was that the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. Self-defense is right there in the text, though this right only applied to Protestants, not Catholics. One could argue that the basis for the Second Amendment is steeped in prejudice and discrimination, and you would not be wrong. But one may also note that last part, as allowed by law. Even in 1689, the English recognized and documented the need for gun regulation in their Bill of Rights. The fact is, the Founding Fathers were big believers in gun control. American citizens were subject to far more restrictive gun laws back then than we have in the United States today. For example, men of age for military service were legally required to own a weapon suitable for military use, like this replica of a Brown Bess flintlock rifle. They were required to show up for muster, like these folks, to demonstrate the functionality of their weapon and their proficiency in its use. They were required to register their weapon with the government and to surrender it should it be needed for military use, even if its owner was not. Fun fact, this is precisely where the term passing muster comes from. It's a phrase we use today to mean something good enough to pass, but it's a direct reference to militiamen showing up to demonstrate gun proficiency. Several other English phrases in use today have their origins with these flintlocks that they used in the 18th century. This here is the cock, which is named because it looks like a rooster. When it's in the half-cock position like this, it won't fire. It's a safety mechanism to let you load gunpowder into the pan here without the gun going off accidentally. If you forget to fully cock the cock before you run into battle, your gun won't fire. Hence the term, going off half-cocked. The flintlock works by clamping a piece of flint into the cock here, and then when the trigger is pulled, the flint strikes this steel frisson, this flippy thing here. That creates the sparks that ignite the gunpowder that's in the pan. The pan has a touch hole in the bottom, so that the sparks go down into the base of the barrel, and that ignites the main charge that's been loaded through the muzzle. If the charge in the barrel doesn't ignite, even though the powder in the pan ignites, it's called a flash in the pan. If the gunpowder is too damp, it won't ignite at all, hence the saying, keep your powder dry. Early on, it took several different craftspeople to create a weapon like this. The lock mechanism was created by a locksmith, woodworkers built the stock, and barrels were made by coopers, or barrel makers. When entrepreneurs started selling fully built guns, they would use the term lock, stock, and barrel to advertise their fully assembled wares. Guns are so integral to the history of this country and our culture that they're baked right into the language. People talk about flintlocks every day and we don't even realize it. And by the way, if you want to see flintlocks in action on film, you cannot beat Last of the Mohicans. The weapons work is so good. There's a bit in the middle where Hawkeye borrows silk to use for wadding because it adds 30 yards of accuracy to a shot. The detail of how they use the weapons is spot on. In the Old West, gun control was the norm. Despite what Hollywood would have us believe, the frontier was relatively civilized. Amongst the white immigrants and settlers, I mean, they were horrifically brutal towards the indigenous Native American peoples that they encountered, which is a whole different story, but definitely one that intersects with this one a lot. On the frontier, concealed carry was considered cowardly and dishonorable, and was illegal in most states. Many towns like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona were supposedly infamous for gun violence, but were actually relatively safe zones on account of laws forbidding the carrying of weapons within city limits. There were 5 recorded gunshot deaths in Tombstone in 1881, the year of the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. 3 of those deaths were members of the Cowboys gang that the Earp brothers shot down that day, a direct result of the fact that the outlaws were violating gun laws. And for the record, Wyatt Earp is way better than Tombstone. Dennis Quaid is a way better Doc Holliday than Val Kilmer, and you can fight me about it at Can later. During the Civil War, thousands of free black citizens served in the Union Army. Naturally, they were armed, and many owned their own weapons. After the war, the newly freed slaves in the South were granted full rights as American citizens, granting them the right to bear arms in theory. In practice, freed slaves were systematically disarmed by a new vigilante group called the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan originally formed for the purpose of disarming black folks, and in the South, for the most part, they succeeded. So just as the Catholics had been discriminated against back in England after the Glorious Revolution, African Americans suffered similar discrimination in their right to have a gun for self-defense. That prejudice persisted into the 60s, by which time opinions had flipped regarding concealed carry laws. If an individual could demonstrate the need to carry for self-defense, they could petition local law enforcement for a license. Few could argue more of a need than Martin Luther King Jr., yet his applications were denied, as was almost certainly the case for any black folks who tried to apply. Even though Dr. King embraced nonviolence, he was realistic about the need for self-defense for himself and his family, and he was usually surrounded by an armed entourage. And as we know, his fears were more than justified. Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton founded the Black Panthers for Self-Defense in Oakland, California in 1966, taking their inspiration from Malcolm X. They organized to protest several high-profile incidents of police shooting unarmed black men. Sound familiar? Huey was a law student who recognized that according to California law and the Second Amendment, there was nothing stopping them from exercising their right to bear arms on public property. Open carry was legal in California, and it was legal to observe the police from a reasonable distance of 8 to 10 feet away. So they started following the cops around, patrolling them, fully armed, to keep them accountable. This was the first time a group had exercised their Second Amendment rights in this way as a form of protest. Something we see commonly from gun rights advocates today, I might add. This form of protest did not go over well with the cops, or the folks in the legislature. The Mulford Act was introduced in 1967 by Republican Assemblyman Don Mulford. It was a bill that made it a misdemeanor to have loaded weapons in public places. Though it was denied, it was obvious that this was a direct response to the Panthers exercising their right to protest. When the bill came up for debate, Bobby and Huey decided to take the Panthers to the State House to protest. They showed up on the lawn, fully armed, 24 men, 6 women, carrying 23 loaded guns. They did not know that the governor was going to be there as well, addressing a group of elementary school kids. Governor Ronald Reagan. They used the media opportunity to make a public statement right there in the midst of the confusion. And when the Capitol Guards showed up, they headed into the Capitol building. And despite intending to head for the spectator section, they wound up on the actual assembly floor, with the legislature in session and all the assemblymen present. And they were armed to the teeth. People kind of freaked out. The Mulford Act passed. with the full support of the GOP-controlled California legislature and was signed into law by Governor Reagan. The first major gun control laws in a generation were enacted because Reagan and the California Republicans were scared of black folks. A rash of gun control laws were enacted in the next few years at the state and federal level. That, in turn, started to worry a segment of the hunting community, which brings us to the National Rifle Association. Improbably, the NRA was created in 1871 by a New York Times reporter and a couple of Union Civil War vets. Their original mission was to educate Northerners in marksmanship, because they sucked compared to their Southern neighbors. Their motto was, firearms safety education, marksmanship training, shooting for recreation. I am down with that motto. I think that's a great motto. Back then, the NRA didn't talk about the Second Amendment. No one did, really, until the Black Panthers brought it up. The NRA were champions of gun control in their first iteration. In the 20s, they wrote gun legislation that was adopted in 9 states, requiring a permit to carry a concealed weapon, 5 years in prison if a gun was used in a crime, waiting periods, and records of gun sales. In the 30s, they helped Franklin Delano Roosevelt draft the 1934 National Firearms Act and the 1938 Gun Control Act, which placed heavy taxes and regulation on guns commonly used in crimes, like machine guns, sawed-off shotguns, and silencers. Gun sellers and owners had to register with the government. Convicted felons were banned from life for owning a gun, and all of this was held up unanimously by the Supreme Court. In 1934, NRA President Carl T. Frederick stated the following in testimony before Congress. I have never believed in the general practice of carrying weapons. I do not believe in the general promiscuous toting of guns. I think it should be sharply restricted and only under licenses. Cut to the 60s. Another fun fact. Lee Harvey Oswald killed JFK with a mail-order rifle purchased from the NRA's flagship magazine, American Rifleman. That fact, along with the other assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, plus the open carry protests of the Black Panthers, created enough public support for new gun legislation that the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed. It banned mail-order sales of rifles and shotguns and prohibited most felons, drug users, and people found mentally incompetent from purchasing guns. In congressional hearings, NRA Executive Vice President Franklin Orth expressed support for a mail-order sales ban, stating, "We do not think that any sane American who calls himself an American can object to placing into this bill the instrument which killed the President of the United States." The NRA not only supported that law, they helped create it. This new gun legislation was starting to make some hunters nervous that maybe the government was coming for their guns next, and many of them, who weren't already members, turned to the NRA. And this new influx of members were self-defense true believers, putting them at odds with this old guard. An incident in 1971 sparked a turning point in the gun rights debate. The ATF served a warrant on one Kenyon Ballou, who happened to be an NRA member. A neighbor witnessed him playing around with grenades in his backyard and reported it to the authorities. And when the agents showed up, Ballou didn't open the door for them. And after they busted it down, a scuffle ensued. Ballou was shot in the head, though he survived while suffering brain damage. Divergent stories emerged as to what actually happened. The NRA and gun rights activists portrayed the incident as law enforcement overreach, writing articles in American Rifleman stating that the ATF had busted down the door without warning, shot Ballou while he and his wife were in the bathtub together, and that the grenades in question were just toys. This narrative spread throughout the gun rights community and radicalized many to the idea that the government was coming after their guns. Ballou sued the government, and the trial revealed that he did indeed have decommissioned grenades, and that he had the capability to make them active again. The judge believed that he had heard the agents announce that they were serving a warrant, and rather than opening the door, he ran for a weapon and confronted the agents, buck naked, wielding a Civil War revolver, and his girlfriend was standing there in her underwear, also pointing a gun at them. The bathtub detail was a lie. The agents noted that Ballou was bone dry after the shooting. The agents shot in response to a legitimate threat. But the propagandized narrative has always prevailed, and people refer to it to this day as evidence for gun rights arguments and as a precursor to the debacles at Ruby Ridge and Waco. In 1975, the Institute for Legislative Action was formed. It was the new political lobbying wing of the NRA, focusing on representing the rights and interests of gun owners, and more importantly, manufacturers. They were the self-described bastard stepchildren of the NRA, but they were backed by this new influx of members. In 1977, at the NRA annual meeting, the lobbyists gathered sufficient votes to stage a coup. and took control of the organization. They dismissed the board and the president and replaced them with folks loyal to their agenda. They essentially told anyone who wasn't down with their new direction that they could go join the Sierra Club, and many did. After the coup, the second half of the amendment was prominently displayed on the wall of the lobby in NRA headquarters, but there was no longer any mention of the militia clause. It was the turning point where the NRA transformed into the political creature that it is today. These advertisements from American Riflemen that I found in a Mother Jones article illustrate the NRA's dramatic change in direction. The first one is from 1920, and it's an NRA advertisement that's actually in Boys Life magazine, the Boy Scouts of America's magazine, promoting marksmanship clubs. Notably, they referred to themselves as a United States government organization, which I find a dubious assertion. In 1951, they were selling Red Ryder BB guns so kids all over America could put their eyes out. 1957 was all about joining fellow sportsmen for good, healthy fun for the low cost of $5. But by 1970, we start to see the effects of the 60s gun control laws having an effect. Hunters beware. Don't let's kid ourselves, Mr. Hunting Enthusiast. They are powerful forces, possibly well-intentioned, but ill-informed, working eagerly and relentlessly to curb and eventually to abolish the hunting rights, privileges, and freedoms that you enjoy today. 1973 ratchets up the rhetoric. Only you can save hunting. In 82, they had a wildly successful I'm the NRA campaign, employing a gentler tone, and children. But later in the 80s, things get dark, really dark. I'm not even going to say those things out loud. By 93, they're using Nazi imagery to demonize their opponents. And by 2013, they'd sunk to accusing President Obama of not caring about little kids. Former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and famous Minnesotan Warren Berger had this to say about the NRA in 1991.
If I were writing the Bill of Rights now, there wouldn't be any such thing as the Second Amendment.
Which says?
That a well-regulated militia being necessary for the defense of the state, the people's rights to bear arms. This has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. Now just look at those words. There are only 3 lines to that amendment. A well-regulated militia. If the militia, which was going to be the state army, was going to be well-regulated, why shouldn't 16 and 17 and 18 or any other age persons be regulated in the use of arms, the way an automobile is regulated?
The greatest pieces of fraud upon the American people. He gets right to the point. Fine, you have the right to a gun, but it's not unlimited. It's subject to regulation. Why shouldn't people be regulated in the use of arms the same way we regulate automobiles? And that's the hard line the NRA took after the coup. That any and all regulation leads down this slippery slope to gun confiscation. The one message at the base of all of their arguments is that the ultimate goal of their opponents is full gun legislation confiscation. And they've never been subtle about it.
So, as we set out this year to defeat the divisive forces that would take freedom away, I want to say those fighting words for everyone within the sound of my voice to hear and to heed, and especially for you, Mr. Gore. From my cold, dead hands.
Here's the thing. It's a lie. Guns aren't ever going to get banned in this country, and they know it. Regulation is legal, and they know it. But that doesn't fit their agenda, which at the end of the day is all about supporting the gun manufacturing industry and their profits. These days, there are many faces to the NRA, including Wayne LaPierre, Dana Lesh, Colin Noir, and the latest member of their merry band, Oliver North. Their agenda is to block almost any and all gun legislation, period. It's all based on this falsehood, this myth, that guns will ever fully be banned in this country. We have over 300 million guns in this country, and thanks in no small part to the NRA. They're not going anywhere, and most folks these days don't want them to. And thanks to one pivotal Supreme Court case, DC versus Heller, the self-defense interpretation is the law of the land, and that doesn't look to be changing anytime soon. But the good thing about this decision is that it also states the need for common sense gun legislation. Dick Heller was a security guard in Washington, D.C. who lived in a bad neighborhood. He was allowed to carry a weapon on the job, but thanks to D.C.'s ban on handgun ownership, one of the most restrictive laws in the country, he was not allowed to have a gun in his home for self-defense. One could have a rifle or a shotgun for recreation, but it had to be stored, unloaded, disassembled, or fitted with the trigger lock, making it difficult to use for self-defense purposes. Alan Gura, a libertarian lawyer looking to try a case that would challenge this restrictive gun law, found Heller in a search for plaintiffs. Heller was the one person that the court deemed had standing for a case, meaning he had been directly affected in a negative way by the law, allowing the case to proceed to trial. Illogically, the NRA opposed the case and did everything they could do to sabotage it. They were afraid that if such a case went before the Supreme Court and lost, it would set the gun rights movement back decades. They tried to file their own case and have it combined with Gura's case so that they could take it over and bury it. And they tried multiple times to get a lower court judges to dismiss the case. But in the end, the inexperienced Gura made it all the way to the High Court. He faced Walter Dellinger as the defense attorney for Washington, D.C., who was an extremely experienced lawyer who tried many cases before the Supreme Court and had also served as the Solicitor General under the Clinton administration. After a deeply dramatic trial, the court decided 5-4 in favor of Heller, definitively establishing that D.C.'s gun law was unconstitutional and that the self-defense interpretation of the Second Amendment was constitutional. But Justice Antonin Scalia's majority decision left the door wide open for the kind of regulation that Justice Berger referred to. Here's the man himself in a Fox News interview with Chris Wallace discussing his majority decision in D.C. versus Heller.
Let's turn to an issue that is in the news right now with the massacre in Colorado, and that is gun control. You wrote in 2008 the opinion in District of Columbia v. Heller, the majority opinion that said the Second Amendment means what it says. People have a right to bear arms. Question: how far does that constitutional right go? Can a legislature ban semi-automatic weapons, or can it ban magazines that carry 100 rounds without violating an individual's constitutional right to bear arms?
What the opinion in Heller said is that it will have to be decided in future cases what limitations upon the right to keep and bear arms are permissible. Some undoubtedly are, because there were some that were acknowledged at the time. For example, there was a tort called affrighting, which if you carried around a really horrible weapon just to scare people, like a head axe or something, that was, I believe, a misdemeanor. So, yes, there are some limitations that can be imposed. What they are will depend on what the society understood were reasonable limitations at the time. There were certain location limitations. What
about these technological limitations? Obviously, we're not now talking about a handgun or a musket. We're talking about a weapon that can fire 100 shots in a minute.
We'll see.
Heller makes prohibition a deeply problematic proposition. But there are laws and regulations that we can enact that would have an effect on the problem and save lives that don't involve banning guns. This is precisely what Justice Berger was talking about, and now it's been established as constitutional in D.C. versus Heller. Regulation of guns is constitutional and not mutually exclusive with the rights granted by the Second Amendment. Regulation is not necessarily infringement. The conversation needs to change. For far too long, the NRA has controlled the narrative regarding gun culture in the U.S. If we took a few pages from the original NRA playbook and focused on gun safety, we could make a real difference. We need common sense gun safety legislation, and we need it yesterday. Which brings us back to the seed at the basis of my idea for the show: mandatory safety training. I think guns need to be licensed, and proficiency exams should be mandatory for receiving and maintaining a license. This is Founding Fathers 101 stuff here, passing muster in the 21st century. Once again, Justice Berger asserted that there's no reason guns shouldn't be regulated in the ways similar to how we treat cars. We have a background check system for gun sales, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS, thanks to the Brady Bill of 1985. James Brady was Ronald Reagan's press secretary and was paralyzed by a bullet during the assassination attempt upon the president. In the wake of the assassination, the Brady Bill was introduced, a provision of U.S. federal law that requires a waiting period for handgun purchases and background checks on those who wish to purchase handguns, creating the NICS. Once again, Reagan became a champion of gun safety legislation, The first president, who was endorsed by the NRA, wanted this bill passed, and they had to go along with it. They did so, begrudgingly, but managed to get a rule into the bill stating that if the computer database wasn't completed within a certain time frame, then the program would be defunded. They banked on the idea that the computer technology wasn't available to implement the plan and hoped it would die in its infancy. Luckily, they were wrong. Today, the NICS is, like any database, only as good as the data that's entered into it. For example, regulations are lax, requiring law enforcement to enter cases of people found guilty of domestic abuse, thereby allowing people who aren't legally allowed to purchase weapons to do so anyway, because their cases aren't being entered into the system in the first place. On top of the bad data, we have the problem of the private sales loophole. Research has found that 40% of gun sales circumvent background checks by avoiding licensed gun dealers. This happens in a number of different ways, oftentimes at gun shows, giving the problem the misnomer gun show loophole. Dealers at gun shows are required by law to have their federal firearms license and run background checks. The problem is the private sellers show up to these shows, walk around the floor with a sign indicating they have weapons for sale, and do private transactions out in the parking lot. We also have the issue of straw purchases, where people with clean records purchase guns for people who are legally barred from having them. This is how the Columbine shooters got their guns. One shooter's girlfriend purchased the guns for them at a gun show, with the underage boys present, and basically completed the transaction themselves. She wasn't even required to do a full background check, she just had to show her ID. She has been quoted as saying it would have been far more difficult for the boys to have gotten their hands on weapons if people like her could be deterred from doing so by being required to run a background check. Many gun rights advocates push back hard against registering private sales between family members because they feel like it infringes on their civil rights. A liberal gun enthusiast friend of mine explained to me how silly that argument was when you consider that all you have to do is go to any licensed gun dealer with the person you're selling and the person who's buying, run the check for a nominal fee of about 20 bucks. It doesn't take but a half an hour. And it's not an inconvenience, much less an infringement of their rights. We need to have conversations about hardware, like bump stocks and magazine capacity. The NRA supposedly supports limits on bump stocks, but they're not exactly introducing legislation to that effect. I've gotten a lot of pushback from friends who do competitive shooting in regards to magazine capacity, but I remain unconvinced that anyone needs a high-capacity magazine for self-defense purposes, so it's fair game to legislate it. We also need to build in a grandfather clause to make sure that currently law-abiding gun owners aren't turned into criminals overnight. Another argument to consider is that in the gap between a law's passing and implementation, a run on the banned hardware can occur, defeating the intended purpose of the law by flooding the market with something it's supposed to limit, and also further filling the coffers of the gun industry. One of the legislative ideas with the biggest potential are red flag laws. They give family members, friends, or co-workers who fear an individual is going to commit gun violence an opportunity to file a gun violence protection order. That empowers the court to remove a person's weapons for a set period of time. Such a law might well have stopped the Parkland shooting, considering how much warning there was on social media and from those who knew him. Soon after that incident, Republican Governor of Florida, Rick Scott, signed a red flag bill into law, though many other states are resistant to that legislation. The NRA and the conservative magazine The National Review have actually come out in favor of these laws. NRA chief lobbyist Chris W. Cox said protection orders could, quote, stop dangerous people before they act. There will always be evil in this world. That won't change. But we can change our response. We can take action and prevent violence and protect the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding Americans at the same time. Yet, state legislatures all over the country, including here in Minnesota, won't even bring bills like this up for discussion. The Republican-led Minnesota House squashed a protection order bill and a universal background check bill in March of this year. In 1996, Representative Jay Dickey of Arkansas inserted a rider into the omnibus spending bill that stated that none of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the CDC may be used to advocate or promote gun control. The amendment, which was heavily lobbied for by the NRA, was the law of the land until March of this year, when it was further amended to state that they could finally do gun violence research. Then, just last month, the House rejected a $10 million CDC funding proposal for gun violence research, zeroing out their budget on this once again. Defunding the CDC like this has hamstrung an agency that has a proven track record of saving lives. Their implementation of the World Health Organization's responsible suicide reporting guidelines have demonstrated a significant decrease in suicides in America. For example, they avoid focusing their reporting on the gory details, and they keep it about remembering the person. When the media follows these guidelines, it saves lives. When Robin Williams died, it was overwhelming for many of us. There was a media frenzy. The rules were largely ignored, and the methods of his suicide were widely made public in the media. CDC research revealed that a 10% spike in reported suicides in the wake of Robin's death. Those guidelines work, and they could be applied to incidents of gun violence. If we were to apply that methodology to the reporting of school shootings, it might help stem the tide of an epidemic of violence. Right now, we don't have any guidelines, and it shows. Robin starred in that Broadway transfer of the show that I did the blood effects for, Bengal Tiger at the Baghdad Zoo. And in the spirit of remembering those that we have lost, I wanted to share this with you. It's the first time that we put the blood rig on him for a test.
Okay, here we go.
This should be cool. Guess I was great. This is just wonderful. This is just wonderful. Starts with a triangle on the dart, ends with a bullet. It's so stupid.
We lost him 4 years ago yesterday. He was one of the kindest and most authentic people I have ever known. Another area that desperately needs more money for research is on how to prevent suicides in the first place. This area where they have already had much success. Some 40% of gun deaths are suicides. One of the issues that I think the CDC should be studying is how to identify people who wish to do themselves harm and separate them from their guns. This is where the issue gets very personal for me and my mom and my family who are here for the first time tonight. 2009, my Uncle Tim took his life with a Civil War-era revolver, family heirloom. He had been in a nearly fatal car accident the year before, resulting in brain damage and months of rehabilitation. Just when those closest to him thought he was out of the woods, he chose to take his own life. His psychiatrist told my mom that his mental condition took a great deal of training to diagnose, well beyond their capabilities and expertise. By all appearances, he was fine. The insurance company paid out his life insurance policies because the death was deemed the result of the brain damage from the original accident, which gives me some comfort. In truth, I believe he would have found a way to follow through with his plan with or without a gun. But I think about how many months he was in the hospital and in psychotherapy, and when he was released, at no point did his return to access to firearms trip any alarms. That shouldn't happen. But it happens all the time, and I want to help find ways to fix that. More than any other one thing, I am doing this show because of him, and for him, and also for me, so I can make some sense of all of this and make something useful out of it. I have learned a ton since I started working on this show, and I now know enough to know that I've just scratched the surface of an absurdly complicated issue that gets crazier by the day. Case in point. Perhaps it will be a handy thing for the NRA that their new president, Oliver North, has first-hand experience regarding shady deals with foreign governments. Don't buy the NRA's BS. Guns are never going to get banned in this country. It's just not going to happen. Not in any of our lifetimes. The fact that there are plenty of progressive and liberal Americans who believe in gun ownership ensures this. The majority of the people in our country support gun ownership, and I count myself among them. History tells us repeatedly that prohibition is problematic. Safety legislation and regulation are necessary, and results are achievable. The majority of Americans support the measures that I've mentioned. They poll very well. We need to flip the script and recognize this common ground and take it. If we can do that, we can get strong legislation passed that will save lives. If you want to know more about this topic, I highly recommend the book Gunfight by Adam Winkler. Much of my research was drawn from it, and you can get it as an audiobook. Radiolab did a great podcast based in turn on that book called Gun Show. It features interviews with Bobby Seale, Dick Heller, and those guys from the NRA who staged the coup. Pod Save America and Pod Save the People are fantastic podcasts that cover this issue a lot. The majority and minority decisions of DC versus Heller are compelling reads in and of themselves. And I've read and watched a fair amount of NRA programming and conservative media for balance. I've only scratched the surface of this. There is so much more. Please feel free to fact check me, and I'm sure I've gotten something completely backwards. These kids were the spark that lit the fire in me to create this show. I entered the lottery 2 years ago, but my number wasn't picked. The Parkland shooting was the same week as the Fringe lottery back in February of this year. The poise and strength and bravery that those kids showed in the face of their own tragedy got me off my ass. When Amber's reminder hit my inbox, I immediately started the application, and I'm really glad I did because this feels right to me. A portion of the proceeds of this show will be donated to Everytown for gun safety. In their own words, Everytown is a movement of Americans working together to end gun violence and build safer communities. Gun violence touches every town in America. For too long, change has been thwarted by the Washington gun lobby and by leaders who refuse to take common sense steps that will save lives. I would like to encourage you to support them as well. And if any of this story has struck a chord, please take the time to call and talk to your elected representatives about this subject. When more people raise their voices, it strengthens our chances for success. Also, the color orange has been adopted by the gun reform movement as a nod to hunter safety, hence my shoelaces. Wearing orange is another way that I show my support for gun safety legislation, and it creates many opportunities for necessary conversations. I was also inspired by the Ghostlight Project, which is a national collective of theater artists dedicating towards striving for social justice. Mixed Blood is a Ghostlight theater, and I spent the opening ceremony here when we launched it in 2016. The signs you see on the garage door are from that event. One of the ideas that we promote is to pick a subject you're interested in or have knowledge of and study as much about it as you can, with the goal of sharing that knowledge with others. For me, this show is the result. Thanks for going with me on this journey. It felt like something I needed to do for a long time, and it's good to finally be here. Thank you so much for coming to Fringe and supporting independent theater artists. If you feel so moved, please feel free to write a review on the Fringe website, but it's maybe a little late for that. Please go and see lots of shows, especially the ones here at Mixed Blood. Well, I don't really have to say this part anymore either, do I? I've only been able to do this part with some very good friends, especially my friends at Freshwater Theater. Ben Lane's direction has kept me sane and focused as I tried something completely new, and I am immensely grateful to him, and also to the example of friends like Ariel Leaf and J. Merrill Motes. Their examples made it possible for me to even conceive of doing this. Matt Foster and his compatriots at American Civic Forum have been another huge inspiration. Shout out to my friend, confidant, and favorite Fringe tech, Sarah Salisbury. Thanks to Julie Burney and Jim Guy for showing me the way, and no one inspires me as much as Rachel Flynn. Thanks for coming, and good night. While I've got you here, because I have 5 more minutes, please vote. And as I say that, I know I'm preaching to the choir. Please find people in your circle who aren't voting and get them to vote. Because nothing could be more important right now than what we have coming up in the next few months. If you have the opportunity, please stay for the next show. Javier has been an inspiration this week, and his show is friggin' fantastic. There he is right there. Please stay for him. He has basically done for his home of Puerto Rico what I tried to do with this with guns, and you should totally come see it. Sarah and I once actually helped to save a life on this stage. So I hope that this show has the opportunity to do that in the future. And one more thank you for my brother, who helped me a lot with this. And I'm really glad he's here. And thank you all very much. Yes, you do. You can stay down here. Actually, you can hit stop on that. Just hit stop on the recording. It's been recording. It's still. I hit stop. Oh, okay, good. And then the same thing over there. Yeah.
better